I'm so glad you all could join us this warm evening in Santa Fe. And it's probably warm wherever you are as we slide through July. This is our first major members event online. We have over 200 people signed up tonight, which is fantastic. So I want to start by just thanking all of you for your support, for being part of the O'Keeffe Museum. These are unprecedented times. You know, you've heard every cliche imaginable. But as we go through these tumultuous times, we are incredibly grateful for your support, your commitment to the O'Keeffe Museum, and your belief in us and our future. So thank you for being here with us, for being a part of this. Tonight's program will have two parts, basically. First, we're going to hear from Sue Canterbury of the Dallas Museum of Art. Sue is an incredible scholar, curator, and friend. And I'll say a little bit more about her background in a moment, but she'll be talking to us about Ida O'Keeffe and Ida's experience kind of dealing with the shadow of being George O'Keeffe's sister. And then Ariel Plotek, if he's able to connect, we're having a little bit of technical difficulty, will join Sue in a conversation. Ariel's our Curator of Fine Art here at the O'Keeffe Museum. He'll join Sue in a conversation if he can get connected. If he can't, then I'll jump in. To help us with that conversation, please place questions you might have in the chat box. As Debbie mentioned, you can find the chat if you're on the kind of PC or Mac interface. It's usually a button at the bottom of your screen. It may be at other places on the screen if you're on an iPad or another device. But feel free to use that chat box to share any questions you might have, and we'll do our best to answer those at the end of the talk. So let me say just a little bit more about Sue and her background. She is the Pauline Gill Sullivan Curator of American Art at the Dallas Museum of Art and is curator of the exhibition Ida O'Keeffe, Escaping Georgia's Shadow. Before joining the DMA, Canterbury served as associate curator in the Department of Paintings at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, which was preceded by her first curatorial post as assistant curator at the Clark Art Institute, where I also started my career. We didn't overlap, but it is where we met. Once you've worked at the Clark, you never quite leave the Clark. She holds an MA and BA in art history from Williams College and Wellesley College, respectively. Her most recent Dallas exhibitions include Alexander Hogue, the Erosion series in 2014, Edward Steichen in Exaltation of Flowers in 2017, Cult of the Machine, Precisionism and American Art in 2018, and of course, Ida O'Keeffe, Escaping Georgia's Shadow, also in 2018. And I will just introduce briefly Ariel, because it looks like he was able to join us happily. Ariel is the fine art curator here at the O'Keeffe Museum. Before joining us, he was a member of the curatorial team at the San Diego Museum of Art, where he served as the curator of modern and contemporary art, while also teaching as an adjunct professor. His recent projects include Gauguin to Warhol, 20th Century Icons from the Albright Knox Art Gallery, Ron Nagel, Peripheral Cognition, The Art of Music, Louis Kahn, The Power of Architecture, Modern Masters from Latin America, and Nancy Lawrence, Moongold, as well as many projects here at the O'Keeffe Museum since he joined us. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sue to tell us about Ida O'Keeffe and her remarkable experiences. So Sue, it's all yours. We'll go ahead and make the switch in the technology at this moment. And thanks again for joining us, everyone.
And start my video. And we're getting there. Oh no. Sure. Hello. Okay, I think we've got everything working right. Yay. Yes, thank you so much, Cody, for the invitation to speak at the Temple of Georgia O'Keeffe. The two sisters had a very interesting relationship during their life, which started out very loving and ended at the polar opposite. And it is an interesting one to tell. Essentially, it's not easy to, well, let me get this view correctly here. Here we go. It's not an easy story to tell, essentially, because it's a very complex one for the two sisters. What I'm trying to accomplish here essentially is telling the story about Ida herself, reintroducing her, but also I'm telling you about her art. And intertwined in all this is a relationship between two sisters, and as well the deplorable situation for women in general who were artists who were exhibiting at that period in time. And my kitty cat's throwing a tantrum, excuse me here. And so essentially it's a very complicated story to tell. Now, I found that reconstituting a life was a challenging one because it took a great deal of effort to uncover the story, because during Georgia's later life, in her biographies, Ida only served as a backdrop, sort of contextual information that enhanced the story of Georgia O'Keeffe. And so essentially, it took a lot of work. I would say that I worked on this exhibition about a period of 4.5 years. This was all going on in the background while I was working on these other exhibitions. And as I plodded along through this gathering information, I would discover that the depth of the story would grow, and also the idea of Ida and her life, her art would come to the foreground. And so basically, this is the painting that I'll call the Helen of Troy that launched this whole project. It is known as Variational Lighthouse Theme number 2. I was visiting a collector in Dallas when I first spied this hanging on the wall, and I couldn't really put my thumb on who it was by. And I thought, well, it reminds me of Arthur Dove, but it's not Arthur Dove. And so I went up to take a look, no signature, but the owner told me, oh, it's by Ida O'Keeffe. And that sort of floored me. And so, like anyone, I would say that essentially I was rather gobsmacked in a sense to find out that Georgia O'Keeffe had a younger sister who painted. And I would go on to find out that actually there were 2 younger sisters who actually painted, and the other one being Catherine O'Keeffe. And once we committed to the project, once I figured out there was enough there, we committed to the project, and Yves Kahn did this article for the New York Times in about May 30th of 2014. And at that time, I didn't really realize that we were unwittingly, but fortunately, launching what turned into a crowdsourcing situation, in which Yves Kahn said that we were looking for information, and anyone who had works by her or information about Ida O'Keeffe to please get in touch. And this would really open the door to inquiries or emails, phone calls from folks across the US wanting to share with me what they knew about Ida O'Keeffe. The key one, about 10 days later, would be a gentleman calling me from Nashville and said, "You're not going to believe this, but several years ago, I bought a box containing all of the files of Ida O'Keeffe, and as well her scrapbook with all of her exhibition history contained in it." And so I would be able to reconstruct a great deal of information from that in particular. But to start in the beginning, of course, we know that the family came out of Wisconsin, and Ida, her middle name Tenike, she was Ida Tenike O'Keeffe, and she was born in 1889, just 2 years after Georgia. She was the third of 7 children and the second daughter. And in the picture at the upper left, you see Georgia in the middle, and that's Ida to the right, and that's Anita to the left. And then another picture later on of Ida and Anita together. And the family would end up moving to Williamsburg. Francis O'Keeffe wanted to escape what he was sure was going to be his fate of catching tuberculosis, like so many members of his family had done. And so They decided to sell the dairy farm and move to, of all places, Williamsburg, Virginia, which was at that time, believe it or not, being touted by, I guess, these sort of unscrupulous individuals as an ideal place for people with pulmonary diseases or delicacies to move to. And so he fell for this ploy, thinking he was going to a spot that would be safe from tuberculosis. And they moved there. And as soon as they got there, they would enter Georgia into Chatham Hall. Well, at that time, it was Chatham Episcopal Institute, which was about 250 miles away from Williamsburg. However, in the summer, she would come home. And here we have two drawings that are in the O'Keeffe Museum collection that show Georgia pressing into service as a model, Ida, on two consecutive summers. On the left, first in 1904, where she looks a bit sullen, and the one on the right, 1905. And the thing about the one on the left is that Ida was a real outdoors person. She loved to climb trees and, you know, keep out in nature. So I'm sure she found it rather painful to sit there for extended periods of time for Georgia to get her likeness. But eventually, Ida too would go to Chatham Episcopal Institute, now Chatham Hall. And she entered in 1905, 3 months after Georgia had graduated from Chatham. And the interesting thing about Ida was it seemed like she always had an knack for being places at a time of cataclysmic events. And such was the case her first year, freshman year at Chatham. There was a fire, a major fire on February 16th that burned down this main central building where all the offices and the classrooms and even the dormitories were held within that one structure, which led to emergency measures, of course, for housing students in the village. Emergency housing was built, you know, little cabins, etc., where the girls could stay until a new building could be constructed. And the following year, in Ida's sophomore year, she did this little illustration for their annual yearbook called the Mortar Board. And it was to advertise to her fellow students that the coming fall, the new building would be ready, would be open. And this really illustrates her knack for illustration at the time and for storytelling. And this is something she would go on to rely on later in life as an not only as an artist but also as a author, in which she could illustrate her own stories. And you'll notice at the lower left there, that's Tiggy, the dog, Brown's dog, because Buster Brown was invented as a character in about 1904. And while she was at Chatham, she studied with Elizabeth Willis, who had also been Georgia's teacher. Now, this is the fourth teacher that Ida and Georgia shared in common. They had had three teachers in Wisconsin at various points that they both had studied with, and now Elizabeth Willis made the fourth. Ida got good marks, but she doesn't seem to have distinguished herself particularly as Georgia had with Mrs. Willis. And Mrs. Willis would continue to regale her students with the wonders of Georgia O'Keeffe and what a wonderful student she had been. And so already at that point, Ida was sort of operating in the shadow of Georgia. And fortunately, in the junior year, Ida would finally be featured because Chatham had a rule. Only juniors and seniors could be photo documented in their annual. And this was a year that the new building, the sort of remade Chatham Episcopal Institute, changed the name of its yearbook to the Iris, from Mortar Board to the Iris. And here we see Ida depicted in one of the budding carnations in the arrangement right. And we also learned from her, well, from the book, that Ida as well had been on the inaugural basketball team at the school, and as well the inaugural tennis team below. Now, one of the really key things to this project was, again, all the people who came forward to offer information. And of course, I was given some really great moments here. This particular work is in Claudia O'Keeffe's scrapbook, which is held at the Research Center there in Santa Fe. But one of the fantastic things that happened was that a gentleman contacted me from the Pacific Northwest who told me that his two great aunts had been classmates of Ida O'Keeffe's at Chatham Hall. And one of them, the two twins were, they were called Elizabeth and Catherine Keeler. And Elizabeth basically had a girl crush on Ida, and she admired her no end. And she would write home to her parents about Ida to tell them the latest things she was up to. And so from these letters, one is able to gather what Ida was like, her character. And Elizabeth would write that Ida loved to dance and she loved palmistry, and that she also participated in oratory on Tuesday evenings. And she also shared with her parents that Ida didn't expect to return to Chatham the next year. And indeed, Ida did not return for her senior year due to the failing finances of the O'Keeffe family. Francis O'Keeffe may have been a good dairy farmer, but he was not a businessman. He had had several failed businesses in Williamsburg, and the family's money continued to dwindle to the point where they could not afford to send Ida to Chatham for her senior year. Instead, she returned to Williamsburg, sat out the year, and also looked after her mother because her mother had just been diagnosed very recently with tuberculosis, ironically. They fled to Williamsburg to escape tuberculosis, and they found it instead, but it was Mrs. O'Keeffe who caught it. And so Ida was there to help her mother, but also to help prepare the family to move to Charlottesville in the summer of 1909. And so that is what Ida did. And once there, she could help get the house settled, but in the fall, she'd returned to essentially go back to school at the new school in Williamsburg, which was the Williamsburg Female Institute. And she would stay with her father as a day student while she could finish up her senior year. And so she didn't graduate until the spring of 1910. And once that was over, she returned again back to Charlottesville in the summer and started taking courses there. And she continued to do so in the summers, and she had already started teaching as of 1910 in high school, the first one being Appomattox, 60 some miles away. So she wasn't even living at home during the school year. But in the summer back in Charlottesville, she would go to UVA. And in the summer of 1912, she and Anita and Georgia would all take a course at UVA from Alain Beeman. He used to be the fifth teacher that Ida and Georgia shared in common at this period. Now, also in that summer 1912, Ida took a course in the short story, and she had her first yarn published in the Charlottesville newspaper that summer. And that is about the same time when this picture here, which is really quite charming. She's not a beautiful girl, but still a very, very soft sort of aspect to her. And so she would continue through teens to teach at various schools in Virginia, all the way from home, and would return to visit, of course, in the summers. And Georgia was doing something very similar, teaching in Virginia, South Carolina, and even in Texas. And the two would turn up in New York in 1918, and Ida would get there first. Ida decided to apply to become a nurse. She answered the call of the Red Cross. World War I had just started and they needed nurses. And so she started school at Mount Sinai in April of 1918. And one of the great things about this, you see her application on the left, and the larger application had all this really great information about where she had taught and where she had studied, et cetera. So it was incredibly helpful in rebuilding her story. And here we see the nurse's residence where she would have lived while she was in school on the right side there. But within 5 months of being there, she also, another cataclysmic event, the flu pandemic in 1918 hit, and it hit the Sinai Nursing School very hard. 85 nurses were hospitalized in one wing of the hospital, and out of those, 4 of them died. But Ida, nonetheless, persisted. She would be there for 3 years, and you see a picture of her at her graduation in March of 1921. Now, one of the great things about this was getting hold of the records at Mount Sinai, and so we had the opinions of her professors to give us again another look at what Ida's character was like at this period of time. And here to the right of her, you see basically the superintendent of nurses, Elizabeth Greener. And she remarked of Ida in the records, "Miss O'Keeffe is a peculiar girl, can do excellent nursing work, but wants to do everything according to her own ideas. Teased a great deal by her classmates, but liked by them. Will never make a well-balanced leader. Will work best under direction." And she continued on to say, "Inclined to be erratic in certain ways, somewhat stubborn, but very conscientious." And another fun side of Ida was showed through another supervisor of her practical work. And this woman wrote, "Resist criticism, likes own way, does not cooperate, too disagreeable and inclined to be stubborn." But in spite of all of these character flaws, it seems that Ida still graduated that spring of 21. After that, Ida would remain in New York. She'd continue nursing at the hospital. Even there was a time or two that she would look after Alfred Stieglitz. But in the summers and sometimes in the falls, she would spend time at Lake George at the Hill. And here we see her here before the house in this photograph by Stieglitz. But of all the times that she went there, I will focus particularly on the fall of 1924, when she came in September and did not leave until mid-November. And, whoops, sorry, I went the wrong way. And during this time, it seemed Stieglitz developed a real fascination for Ida. And both Georgia and her. And Georgia would write, to her friends, "There's nothing like Ida. She brings in flowers, decorates the place, and she really relieves Stieglitz much. Stieglitz just really enjoys them and enjoys her, and it's really fun to see." And then on the other hand would write to friends that he'd never seen anyone so well balanced as she. She was fascinating. She was so much like Georgia in some ways, but so vastly different in others. Whereas Georgia didn't enjoy the domestic side of things, Ida loved it. Georgia was more introspective and turned inward, where Ida was just really very much so outgoing and effusive in her character. And Stieglitz was also very fascinated with how Ida was also a good shot. And so we see here this picture of her with a rifle and squirrel. She bagged that squirrel with one shot, and then she essentially skinned it and cooked it. And he was really incredibly impressed, as we can see from his inscription on the reverse of the picture. And during this time, everyone just got along famously. She helped Georgia relax and lighten up, and Stieglitz as well. And they took their meals, of course, out on the porch at the Hill. And but that was a particularly magical fall, where everything seemed to be going right, the weather, everyone getting along. And so essentially, Ida told Stieglitz, "We've all been bitten by the magic bug." And it seemed like everyone was irresistible. And that included Stieglitz. Normally, these times that George worked, and he would catch up on work, he would spend time in his print room, printing out various photographs he'd taken only that summer during the year. But instead, suddenly, everyone just was overtaken by the sense of playfulness. And so and even Georgia, as you can see, took part in it. And she also dropped usually that very severe persona that one usually sees in pictures of her by Stieglitz. And so everyone is goofing off, having fun. I mean, Georgia, even a full tooth grin at upper right. And you could just see how much everyone really reveled in the presence of the other. And Ida also got on the other side of the camera and took this photograph of Stieglitz in his iconic cape. And then a key event that occurred there during the stay was Ida's birthday. And Stieglitz just felt, he wrote to Rebecca Strand about how special it was and how everything just moved so easily. And Ida just moved easily without any intellectualization, and even the weather cooperated. And this fabulous portrait here, and the candles actually are not lit. It's all the light breaking in from the left there. Originally, I thought they were lit, until I looked really close. But another thing that happened while there was that Stieglitz, developed this real fascination for Ida, and he became very flirtatious. And we see him here looking across the table at her while the whole group is being photographed by a fellow that Ida was interested in, Arnold Ronenbeck, the sculptor and expression officer, whom she felt was someone that she got along with famously. But nonetheless, Stieglitz is very focused on her and fascinated by her. And he also took quite a few photographs of her while she was there. And we see her here in probably the one instance in which she showed the greatest amount of skin ever. Generally, when women came to the Hill, Stieglitz would photograph them. He had photographed Claudia O'Keeffe in the nude, for instance, as well as Georgia Englehart, his niece, had also had photographed like a Strand in the nude, as well as having an affair with her. And he tried to convince Ida to at least let him photograph her back, but she said, no way. And so I think this is the most skin that he ever really saw. But he had this habit also of leaving notes for her. She always slept on the sleeping porch at the Hill, and he was many of them laced with innuendo. And he'd slip them under the door for her to find in the morning. And also sometimes he would do the same with photographs. And this is one photograph that he sent to her, crow feather and apple. And you have to know that at Lake George, there were groves of apple trees around the place of all certain types of varieties. And at this point in the early 20s, there was a variety called the Ida Red. And so he took to calling Ida Red Apple or Little Red Apple. And so when he sent this, and he also took to calling himself Crow's Feather, by the way. So one can definitely see that there, is a sexual innuendo to this particular picture. But in case Ida might miss the point, and no pun intended, but in case she might miss the point, he wrote this note with it. But there's old Crow's Feather, ever jabbed into that reddest of round red apples. And while this all seems very steamy, Ida, and steamy and smoky, and I would say that Stieglitz created a great deal of smoke, but Ida never really let it develop into a fire. She just gave as good as she got. If he pinched and slapped her, she'd do it back, and Georgia laughed. It really cracked Georgia up quite immensely. And one of those loves I mentioned earlier is Arnold Ronenbeck, who was a sculptor and an expression officer, and she really fell for him and felt they had a great deal in common. And she really had hopes of marrying him, but unfortunately, he said that he wanted to marry well, and by that he meant a woman of wealth. And she was quite upset by this because she said, I have no dollars. And so she was quite disappointed in that. But there was one other person that she also was interested in and had started up, I'd say a flirtation with, and that was Paul Rosenfeld, the writer, who one would say was is held responsible, at least by Wanda Corn, a significant arts historian. He's responsible for the Stieglitz-centric view of American modernism. He really championed Stieglitz and his coterie of artists at 291. And he really fell for Ida as much as he could. And he actually asked her to marry him in that coming spring when they were all back in New York. He was a critic for not only for music, but also the theater. And they went out a great deal together. And so they had plans to get married in the month of May. But there was a confrontation probably in about April. And most art historians couch it in the sense that Stieglitz, who was jealous that she had this interest in Rosenfeld, basically scuttled the relationship. But as I put all the letters together and closely aligned them, it became apparent to me that essentially he was really trying to save Ida, that Georgia and Stieglitz were trying to save Ida, because what Stieglitz knew and Ida did not is that Paul Rosenfeld was having affairs. And so there was a confrontation at their apartment in New York, and where they told him that he had to come clean to Ida. He did, told her that he was having affairs with two women, and one of them was married, and he'd been in love with her for at least a couple of years. Ida was shocked, disappointed, and broke off the relationship. And basically, Stieglitz told her, he says, "I can assure you, things were not clean." You know, even though she would want to get back with Rosenfeld, Stieglitz basically said it was not what she wanted to do, and he would try to block that ever happening again, the two of them getting together. But fortunately, Ida had an escape route, and so that April, she started working in a place in Connecticut, a very old gentleman, Mr. Stockel. And while she was not giving him medicines or pills, she had plenty of time to roam around the vast grounds, 1,000 acres, but also to take time in his library, where he had a collection not only of works by Whistler, but also books about Whistler. And she'd been studying closely Whistler's work. And it's that summer she decided she wanted to start painting. And so she got hold of some materials and began. And she went in fits and starts, and would write to Stieglitz that, you know, I've never done this before. I've never painted in oils before. And that really hit me between the eyes, because I had to go down the rabbit hole of what it was like for women at that period in time, their art education. And Ida had been a teacher of art in all these high schools and elementary schools in Virginia during the teens, but she had never painted. And essentially at this period in time, young girls were taught to draw or to use watercolors. It was thought that this would help to develop their aesthetic eye. But oils, those were serious. Those were for men, were for professionals. And the only women who ended up using oils generally had been in a co-ed class, taught, you know, and was in class with men and would work in oils, or they were wealthy women who could basically flaunt convention and, you know, study oils and pay someone to teach them. And so Ida was learning by trial and error in Connecticut during that summer of 25. But nonetheless, one of these early works from 1926, Three Figures by Ocean in York, Maine, shows that she was still channeling, a year later, she's channeling Whistler. And as an example, work from Minneapolis Institute of Arts at lower right. These little works that Whistler did were called notes, or the size of a postcard. And she also approaches her little composition the same way, very abstractly, using 3 bands of color for sand, sea, and sky. And she departs from the monochromaticism of Whistler with the pop of red colors of the children in the tide. Another work from 26, the Still Life with fruit on it, was pretty wonderful. It turned up, a dealer had forgotten he even had it, and it popped up sort of rather last minute. But I wasn't really sure where the work had been done. But nonetheless, I felt again that I saw the influence of Whistler here. And my apologies to Ida here, flipping this to the side, but we get an idea how she's breaking down space again in a very similar manner to Whistler, Whistler's mother at the lower right. But then I had another aha with this. I had asked the Beinecke, they had a box of unfixed photographs that had turned a very orangey sort of color, but I asked them to digitize them. Well, we paid them to digitize them. And in the midst of those was this particular photo at the right. And what you see is a window that's on the porch at Lake George. And you'll notice here, this bracket shelf, well, two bracket shelves. And this pot here looks like to be the pot in the painting. But what this told me is that this was at Lake George, and she basically, her little still life is set up here. And the other thing that really told me it was Lake George was this little still life down here, crow's feather and apple, which was documented in the earlier photograph I showed you. And so this photograph would have been taken the summer of 24. But so that placed this particular painting at Lake George. But Ida would continue to study, improve her technique over time, and learn how to do things fairly properly. And she had progressed enough that by 1927, she was included in this show at the Opportunity Gallery in New York. And that was a show at which Georgia was the curator. And it was about 18 artists in it, most of them women, with the exception of 2 men. And you'll notice Ida didn't exhibit under the name of O'Keeffe. She used her middle name, Ten Eyck, possibly to avoid the appearance of riding on Georgia's coattails, or Georgia maybe not wanting to look as though she was showing favoritism towards Ida. You also know Helen Torr, Arthur Dell's wife, lower, was also in that show. And then she decided, she got some really good reviews from the show, and so she decided to pursue art professionally, and she decided to go back to school at Columbia. And here we have her application to Columbia, to the Teachers College. And this again, the application down the bottom here, gave information that she taught at Appomattox, at Sperryville, and all these various little places in Virginia. And also, this was the first clue to the Williamsburg Female Seminary. There was on this application. So I was constantly gleaning little details. But what was really wonderful about this was that Ida would encounter her 6th teacher, which was Charles Martin. And Georgia also studied with Charles Martin in 1914. She had to go study with him at the Teachers College as part of her requirements before she could come to Canyon, Texas to teach at the West Texas Normal School. And Charles Martin was quite noted for being a stickler about materials to ensure the longevity of an artist's work, but also he was a master of composition. And there are some people who credit him with the one who enabled Georgia to break free from representation into greater abstraction. And he did the same thing for Ida. And one of the courses Ida took with him was titled Creative Design in Painting. Unfortunately, I stumbled across this film that he had created in 1936. It was an educational film. And in it, he essentially sets forth his teaching methods that he used with his students. And it will become apparent in Ida's work how important this was. And within this film, he takes 4 different rectangles and explores 3 different types of line. And the first and upper left is just horizontals and verticals. Upper right, diagonals only as a method of moving you around the composition. Lower left was the overlapping of arcs, the overlapping nesting of arcs that carry you around the composition. And then finally, in the 4th one on the lower right, he would bring horizontal, vertical, diagonals, and arcs together. Now, these are going to be important because they really show up in Ida's works, particularly a series of lighthouses she would do. So keep these in mind as we're looking. And Charles Martin was also known, mostly today he's known by watercolors. There's very few paintings that exist, but here we have one of his works, which shows something he was also known for, the use of black in outlining form, but also using white as a tool to separate fields of color. And you'll see how things are moving horizontally, diagonally. He's using his method here. It's here on the page. Everything is crisp, tight, linear, but it snaps and it moves. It just really moves around the composition. And this is something that he tried to carry on to his students. Now, in the class of serendipity, I love things like this, because at the upper left and the lower right, these two works are looking at the same view. Now, at the upper left is a work in the collection in Florida that was on the back of another watercolor. And so when I visited the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum to look at some of the things that were in storage there, I saw this work on the lower right. And I thought, wait a minute, these two are from the same thing. And so what we see at upper left is essentially Ida before the motif, out in nature. She is on Cape Cod, outside of Provincetown. Every summer, Charlie conducted classes at Cape Cod, on Cape Cod, near Provincetown. And he would teach his students, he'd take them out into the field, and then he would instruct them to take what they'd learned there and then to, in a sense, sort of restructure it, abstract it, and apply those dynamic compositional cues that he had taught to them. And so see here's Ida taking that same view and tightening it up. Things become crisper, more linear, and also more of a diagonal play in moving one around the canvas, or around the paper in this case. And so we see how she's really using this tool here. And that was the summer of '31. But during the year, she worked on a series, a Hide and Light series, which was probably her master's project at Columbia. And she decided to do the series of lighthouses. There were originally 7. The first one was realistic. That one seems to be lost, but I'm told that I was told by 2 different people who saw her kitchen in Whittier, California, many years later, that there was a painting of a lighthouse in the kitchen, realistic, but it was in an oval shape, a shaped canvas, and it was framed with a rope. And that may have been the original, but no one knows where that is now. But this series would be very important because it's going to apply not only the things that Charles Martin has taught her with the diagonals, verticals, and the overlapping arcs, but also the method of dynamic symmetry. And here, another great find at left in storage at the O'Keeffe Museum is a preparatory watercolor for variation on Lighthouse theme number 2. And this gave me really great information on how she probably had worked up one of these for each of the lighthouses, but it showed how she changed the composition to make it more dynamic and to create greater flow. Because if you look at this one, the curve comes up and around, but boom, it butts up against this line here. But for the painting, she decides to get rid of that and let this line continue on down and around. And just, again, it just continues around and around in this really wonderful sort of movement. We see both overlapping, the arcs down here, lines carrying up, and then the rays from the lighthouse carrying you back around and down. Another one, a work from the MFA in Boston. This is a lighthouse theme number 3 with a snow effect. That's why it's a little lighter in comparison to others. And then number 4, this theme number 4, which now these beams are just starting to curve, shoot out straight, and also to curve and arc around the lighthouse complex here and the little outbuildings, and how this eave turns in as one of the beams coming down here to form that eave of the roof. This one comes down to be the roof on this other little outbuilding here. And she started this whole series out with just white, blue, and black, and did shades between, and then she eventually would add, yellow, and then mixing of the yellow and blue would give this really wonderful green. And another one where she really abstracts the lighthouse to the point it looks like a radio tower. But look at all these overlapping arcs here within this, and how this beam of light, though it doesn't issue from the lighthouse itself, comes around and terminates as the mass of this little boat down to the right. The picture plane is the smushed, distance, and closed are all smashed into the foreground, but you have this really wonderful swirl of patterns moving around. And then Lighthouse theme number 5 was a real outlier to this group, which she did in white, red, and black, but she's working strictly here in vertical, horizontals, and diagonals, no arcs whatsoever. But what I loved about this in particular was when I turned it over to look on the back, I found here calculations up at the top, primary numbers, for basically dynamic symmetry. Dynamic symmetry being really based on the Fibonacci series, the mathematical series, and the search for the golden mean. And it was a type of compositional device that was very popular in the 20s, and many artists were using it. And it also involved a bit of geometry of triangles and rectangles and spirals within that she would use. And so even though this wasn't for this particular canvas, it was for a different one, but this proved to me that definitely she had been using dynamic symmetry, as some of the critics had suspected. And then finally, Lighthouse theme number 7, where we have all of it coming together, the horizontals, diagonals, and the arcs, where we're shooting up these rays here, coming back down, and as the light intersects some of the clouds, there's a change in tonality. And again, when it hits the water, another change in tonality, and art carries you down. And look at this wonderful leaping fish here, leaping up right into the light. So this is incredibly dynamic work. And she exhibited these paintings frequently and would continue to exhibit them for the rest of her life. But the thing that also brought to light other influences she would have been looking at this period. And aside from, using these compositional devices she was learning, she was still visiting 291 and on American Place, and at that point in time. And I put as example there in the middle, this My Egypt by Charles Demuth, a work from 1927 that Stieglitz exhibited in the summer of 1930. Not the summer, but in 1930. And Ida was still in school there in New York at Columbia's Teachers College. And we get to see again that same use of arrays, in this precisionist work. And so we see her doing similar things here as well. And then she graduated in June of 32 and immediately went down to the tri-state area of Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, where they all come together there to visit with friends and to look for a teaching position, which unfortunately did not materialize. But she did a lot of works based on nature. This one, Toadstool, which had before this been known as Mushroom, until I found, exhibition checklists. And when I looked at this, I thought, oh, that's very Georgia-ish. But then as I learned more about it, I thought, well, Georgia was influenced by Arthur Dove as well. And I believe Ida was as well. And I just throw up here this array of works by Arthur Dove. The nesting oval was something that he explored quite frequently, as you can see here. Another thing she did, this outdoor sort of landscape with this subject of the royal oak of Tennessee, 30 feet in diameter at the bottom. And it turned out I was contacted by the woman who was a descendant of the people whose yard this tree stood in, and it was known as the Pemberton oak. It actually fell in a storm in 2004, but this was the work that the tree that I had portrayed in that. And the Pemberton oak was famous for Colonel Pendleton Pemberton basically marshaling a militia under that tree, and they marched off to victory in the battle in North Carolina. And here, another work she did that summer, Roses, the proper title, which previously had been known as Gardenias, the picture. Again, a very sort of, what we would think of George in terms of paint application, but Ida does not do the big blown up flowers. She would never do the blown up flowers thing. That's something Sister Catherine would do. which Catherine would catch a lot of heat from Georgia for. And also the right little totem pipe, where she was visiting that summer was in land of the Cherokee Nation. And so she was always fascinated by the First Nation people of America. And so she was very fascinated, did a whole series of Cherokee pipes. And so the lighthouses and the pipes and all these little works from her summer there, as well as an array of monotypes, at which she was very accomplished, we'll see that later, were exhibited in 1933 at the Delphic Studios, opening in March. The month before, Catherine had a show at the Delphic, which had really upset Georgia immensely. And this one probably did not help as well, because essentially it caused this sort of comparison within the press. And if you look at some of these, you'll see up here on the upper right, a family of artists, an art sisterhood. And Georgia had worked very hard, was not happy about her turf being encroached upon in New York City by her two sisters, and making it some sort of sisterhood of the brush situation. And she basically insisted that Catherine and Ida stop painting, and particularly Catherine, because Catherine was flowers. And she wrote to Catherine, told her, I'm going to come tear your pictures to pieces. You know, stop painting, stop exhibiting. And so the two sisters did not communicate for 4 years at least, possibly 5, because Catherine did not come to George's honorary doctorate at William and Mary in the summer of 1938. She's the only sister who did not come. She also insisted that Ida stop painting, but Ida refused. While Catherine and Georgia would eventually make up, at this point, the sister who had been Georgia's favorite, the nicest girl I ever knew, she would say of Ida. At this point, in 1933, their friendship would cease to be, and it would always be in a strained until Ida's death in 1961. But Ida would plod along anyway. She got some very good reviews for the show, but you know, she's out on her own. And it's the Great Depression, early years of the Great Depression. And if I had had someone who to champion her, maybe a good gallery director, a good dealer, a sharp dealer, who would have been able to promote her and introduce her to the right people, but maybe possibly also give her a stipend so she could have concentrated on the work, that had been for her. But basically, one had to do what one must to survive at that period in time. And so she undertook several jobs. One was working, doing editing for some medical company for, published stuff. She also secured a WPA mural project that went to the New York Public Library. And then she also wrote this book on Forest Indians based on Chippewa, or what we would know today as Ojibwe Indians up in the Wisconsin area. And it's told from a children's point of view. It's a 3rd grade reader, and it would be published first in a first edition in 34, and in 1938, 2nd edition. But Ida would go on for the next 10 years to work at various little schools here and there. During the Depression, no one was giving up their jobs, so all of her jobs were always temporary, filling in for a sabbatical or for someone with sick leave. And so she moved 13 times within 10 years to take up these various positions, ranging from New York to New Jersey, North Carolina twice, to Alabama, Missouri, Texas, on and on and on, until she finally ended up in California. But in the 30s, she even explored outright full-on abstraction in this work called Creation, for instance. And here we have the entry of something that I found rather disturbing. I found a French journal, La Revue, in which Ida was featured in September of 1936. And in it, it talked about how good she was, her art, et cetera, and how she also wrote short stories, et cetera, but that she faced real opposition in the form of her brother-in-law. And that sort of stunned me. I was expecting it all to come from Georgia, because previous to this, Stieglitz had actually wanted to exhibit Catherine's and Ida's work, but Georgia wouldn't allow it. And so suddenly I see in this article that essentially he is supposed to be an obstacle, and I couldn't figure out what that was about. And then after the exhibition was on the walls in Dallas, it had been up a good couple months at least. Almost 2 months, just before Christmas, I received a call from a young woman transcribing an artist interview. She was out in Washington State, and it was essentially an interview with the former curator, also artist, Gordon Gilkey. And Gilkey had basically, after his graduation from University of Oregon, had gone out to fair in 36 to 39, and he and Ida became friends. He really liked her work, thought she was a really great artist. And he said, however, he said, Stieglitz seemed to think he had a monopoly on the name of O'Keeffe. And Ida had a solo show coming up in New York. And Stieglitz called up the other dealer and said, hey, we all know there's only one O'Keeffe, and that's Georgia. I've got this, don't do this show. And so essentially it bullied the other dealer into canceling Ida's show. And so suddenly that made sense for me of that mention within that French magazine about this, this obstruction from Stieglitz. And so that was something else that Ida was dealing with at this time. But nonetheless, she just tried to surge forward and exhibit as she could wherever, Chicago, New York, places in the South. And in 1937, she had an exhibition of monotypes, something she had been working on since about 1930. And so here, this was one, again, at the Delphic Studios, we see it upper left, that was devoted purely to her monotypes, and for which she got very good reviews. But also that same year, she published an article, Monotypes, in the Prince Journal. And this is a rather fascinating sort of thing because she wrote in it how she used etchers ink instead of paint, and that she also had a method, a printing method that was quite unusual, rather unorthodox, because she advised individuals, if you do not have a printing press, which she did not, moving from school to school, and many of these little schools didn't have a studio or any print studios. She says, if you don't have a printing press, you can use a clothes wringer, the old-fashioned washing machines with clothes wringers. She says, or you can do what I do. I use my electric iron. So here you have this method of, it works on a small scale, and it's, have paper and plates will travel, and I have my iron as well. And so she could come home, light might not be good for working in oils because of the color. She could work really well in the medium of printer's ink. And she could really gain a great deal of expression and subtleties within these works, as we can see here, the dappling. And so basically she's painting this onto the plate, putting the moist paper onto it, running it through. Now the thing about monotypes is mono means one, you get only print. And so it's basically, it's just this gray space where painting and printing merge together. The thing about her, she had found a way that sometimes she'd get two, which sort of undermined the concept of monotype. But nonetheless, she became very accomplished with it. And here's a couple other examples. And the one on the right actually is a dry point that she did when in Oregon in 1937. But it gives you a sense of how her fluidity with the medium, how good they become with it. But in the summer of 38, she went to teach at a teacher's college in Missouri. And while there, she traveled around the state, went to see Thomas Hart Benton's work. And she makes this switch from abstraction and full-on modernism that we see in the Lighthouse, et cetera, to more sort of regionalist aesthetic. But it's a slightly abstracted aesthetic. And she's still applying a lot of the rules that she learned while she was at Columbia. And so you have these cones of lime here. This is called the Ozark Lime Kiln. And these cones of lime, a little train, empty train I forget what you call them, these little cars going into the left, but they're coming out full of lime on the other side. And this wonderful sort of nocturnal palette that she has, with very soft colors. And immediately at the end of that summer, she would move to San Antonio, Texas, to take on teaching there at Our Lady of the Lakes College for a teacher who was away for the year, the usual situation. But as you can see, wherever she went, she was always in Georgia's shadow. Here, you know, artist sister joins Lady of Lake faculty. I saw other things where I would talk about the artist sister or the a sister-in-law of the great photographer Alfred Stieglitz. And so this was part of the thing that she had to deal with, you know, everywhere she went. And another thing I did was looking at her records of where she had gone. Now, how much was she teaching? What was her course load like? Did she ever really have time for her own, to basically develop her own work? And what I learned was no, she didn't. She was teaching this year an art history course, within one semester, an art history course, 2 painting courses, each of which had 3-hour labs. She had evening classes for the community and hosting other events. But meanwhile, she was exhibiting at the Whitty Museum and becoming part of the community. So the woman was extremely busy. But nonetheless, she did manage to create a few things. The only one I've been able to find is this one. And the DMA acquired this in 2017, Stargazing in Texas. Wonderfully dynamic, but very painting of this young woman on this, in what I will say is probably Hill Country, Texas, San Antonio. And it's dynamic for the way the diagonals are set off center, converging behind her. But I want you to look at the frame at the top. And Ida essentially took a combination of 10 stars, cut them out, snipped out 10 stars that have a very warmth to them because of the iron content in the alloy, but also intersperse them with little foil stars that a teacher might stick on a paper to say, good job. And so she interspersed the two to get this twinkling across the top of the frame. And once she finished up in San Antonio, she went to Cuba for several months to visit with her brother, Francis, her older brother, Francis, who had married a Cuban woman, and they lived in Havana. He was an architect. And so she spent time there, and there she is with her nephew, Francis Wyckoff O'Keeffe Jr. And while there, she also did some painting. This work is in the Texas collection, popped up in the Texas collection, which was great as well, of banana leaves. And it's wonderful brushwork, very sensitive, very smooth in its execution. And she also worked on some prints and this really wonderful, again, revisiting the theme of the lighthouse here at Mora Castle. But she would head back to New York after this and immediately leap into a nursing job at the end of December of 1939. And meanwhile, she would start looking for another job. We have 2 more teaching positions outside of New York City, one first in New Jersey, and then finally in North Carolina, where she would set up an art department for the Pembroke College for Indians in North Carolina. And eventually, though, World War II would break out, and she moved to Whittier, California, and first started out working in the Douglas aircraft industry, doing draftsman's work. And she didn't stay long because she caught the flu, and she wrote to a family friend that the thing that she enjoyed most while at Douglas Aircraft had been the drafting of the pursuit planes, and she named off some of the pursuit planes. But this is the first place she lived, and it's funny, I see the tower, and it's almost like she chose it because it had a lighthouse on the front of it. But she would teach classes, teach painting and drawing privately to private students from the spot. And it was located directly across the street from Whittier College, where at times she would give lectures on abstraction and dynamic symmetry at the college. And it was also just a short walk to the local hospital where she would work as a nurse when she needed the income. And so she was pretty well set. But she, about 4 years later, she moved around the corner down the street to this place a really great bungalow, which was purchased probably about 1948 in Georgia, and Anita may have helped her get the payment for this. But she would live here until her death in 1961. Now, another case of serendipity here. The one at the top left of the front was sent a Christmas card in 1957 to June O'Keefe Sebring, and it's the front of the house. And from another individual in the state of Virginia, the grandson of Ida's friend, in 57, she sent this picture from the back of the house, and here's Ida seated here on the terrace in back of the house. And so it was really great bit of serendipity. But the other thing that was really great, in the grocery store up the street, because I went there to visit just to see where everything was, and then right down the street from her was the Whittier Art Association, where she basically exhibited from about 1943 up until 1960 in solo shows and group shows, but also serve as an officer for the association and also do volunteer for various events, etc. And so everything was really a really wonderful sort of setup for her. And here's a group of banana trees. I initially thought this came from Cuba, but no, it was later. And when I was in Whittier, I realized there are banana trees on there. A banana tree practically is on every corner as an ornamental plant. But this could have been at Laguna Beach as well. At that time, you had the old-fashioned sort of little rail service that would take you all the way to the beach. You could be there maybe in about a half hour. It would be much quicker than trying to drive it today. And also this little work, Black Lilies, and this belongs to a woman who actually took painting lessons from Ida there in the house on South Painter Avenue. And this photo from 1956 shows Ida in an exhibition at the Whittier Art Association. And we see some familiar paintings here. She's holding Lighthouse number 3, which belongs to the MFA Boston now. She's holding that in her hands. And behind her is the Ozark Lime Kiln. And to the right, we see that still life from 1926. And then finally, a work that is in the June O'Keefe Sebring Trust, which is called Flight. There we see there. And so she brought all these things together, was very actively involved and engaged within the group here. Let's see, can I forward this? Oh, it's not forwarding at the moment. My wheels seem to be spinning. But so essentially, Ida would continue on, soldier on, so to speak, living in Whittier. And but as she got older and her health started to fail, I would say it was really wonderful Georgia for, and they would help pay for Ida's medical expenses. However, as the expenses mounted, Anita in Georgia would start to basically tell Claudia that they felt that they should have the deed to Ida's house for insurance, as they put it. Claudia would refuse to broach the subject with them. She would just tell them, just tell me how much it is, and I'll see that you get your money eventually. And this would go on and on. And Ida and Georgia would never communicate. A woman who was a young woman at that time in Whittier told me that she had come to cook for Ida twice a day. And Ida had told her that she and Georgia had not spoken in many a year. And also, Claudia would constantly write to Georgia and say, could you please write to Ida? She would love it so much. It would really boost her spirits. But that really never happened. And so we find ourselves in 1961. And early in that year, Georgia makes the comment that Ida essentially her life was in some ways, hers was in some ways a wasted life. And it seemed to be a rather sort of harsh sort of assessment that Georgia was making of Ida's situation. And when you come to think about it, for Georgia especially, it's almost as she had amnesia, for she too had struggled her life. And when she herself had been in the situation of going from teaching position to teaching position, essentially she had forgotten what Ida had gone through. And it seemed as though also that she was forgetting that her culpability in obstructing Ida, at least not letting Stieglitz exhibit her work, but also the fact that Stieglitz had obstructed her from exhibiting. And so when we stop to think about these things, and we think that, let me pull this up here because I want to get this right. Basically, I will back up here. I'm having technical difficulties. I can't forward the slides here, but Georgia, so she chose to ignore her culpability. And eventually, you know, Stieglitz would block her. And basically they persuaded, persuading this owner, this dealer, to cancel out Ida's exhibition. And, oh, excuse me, I'm getting this here. Well, pardon me, I'm almost there. Okay, good. So, okay, sorry for this. But one of the things I also found very interesting about Georgia was this. Late in her life, when all these biographers are lining up to tell Georgia's story, they would ask her, oh, you had these sisters who painted. Well, what about them? Were they any good? And so basically, Georgia would say, oh, well, the real talent was my sister Anita. Now think about it. Anita was the sister who never painted and never exhibited. In this sense, Georgia was making an effort to basically completely discount any idea that Ida or Catherine had ever possessed any talent whatsoever, which I found very interesting. And so again, here's Georgia editing her story to basically push her sisters out of the picture. And even in 1974, 13 years after Ida's death, the youngest sister, Claudia, who thought that Ida never got her due, she would receive the full brunt of Georgia's rage when she helped to arrange a solo show for Ida in Santa Fe in Georgia's backyard. And so that really angered Georgia. Basically, it's something she still couldn't let go, even 14 years after Ida's death. And so in closing, what I just want to say is that, Ida was undoubtedly talented. Her Lighthouse series represented a high point in which she was poised for greater things to come. She had had the encouragement and financial backing at that crucial point. That would have allowed her a stability of living when she could have developed her art. And I have no doubt that if such had been the case, I would be telling a different story to you now. And while Ida's struggles mirror those of other women artists at the period, she alone faced an additionally heavy burden, and that being the active obstruction of her ambitions by those who had been closest to her and who also had a great deal of power in the art world. And so the rediscovery of Ida and her work, it not only adds her to an of art history, but it also deepens and it enriches it. But it also stresses the thing that just basically that those who become famous don't particularly become famous because they're better than their contemporaries. Sometimes it's because they had a lucky break. And Georgia had an immense lucky break when she was plucked from obscurity in Canyon, Texas in 1918 by Stieglitz. And so art history is littered with the ambitions of so many talented artists who never got that lucky break. And Ida O'Keeffe is emblematic of the majority of creative, talented women who dared to dream, but for whom there were no advocates. And thank you. And I hope this is coming through okay because my screen is sort of locked. So, oh good.
Hello, Sue.
Hi there.
Hi.
Sorry, had some major sort of things going on here.
Oh, no.
We didn't see the last few slides there. Just my wheel started turning on my computer there. Hi.
But I
Hi,
think
Ariel.
all of us are still learning how to use Zoom at this moment. I want to thank you so much for that. And also, I want to thank you for the exhibition. I had a chance to see it at the Clark. And we've had a chance to chat a little before, you and I. And although I have more questions, let me start by sharing some of the questions from our audience, and also inviting any audience members who have further questions for you. I see some popping up now as I speak, to post those in the chat. And with the time we have, I'll try to relay as many of those. So one that was asked, and I think it's rather interesting, concerns what one of our what we have here, a question about a sort of perceived change of style around 1930, and the question suggests that Ida's paintings become more realist, it seems, at that date. And it makes me think of something that struck me about the works on paper, the prints, and that is a very strong romantic current that I recognize in those. What do you think about this observation? Right. Is there a change around 1930?
Not so well. In 1930, there's a drive towards greater abstraction with lighthouses, away from the still life, the stuff prior to her time at Columbia. The big change for me that I see is in 38, when she goes to a regionalist aesthetic, and that becomes, again, much more realistic than she had been practicing with the lighthouses themselves. And of course, there's some realism in the summer of 32, of course, in down in Tennessee, Virginia, when she was that summer there as well. Yes, but I also found it interesting because in the middle of the 30s, they're doing outright abstractions, and it would have been interesting to see where she went with it. But the thing is that all these changes in style was really frustrating for the critics, because they felt that, you know, she was working in two directions at one time, and one actually said that sort of thing. And it would have been better, you know, if she'd had a good dealer who would have said, here, focus on this area, head in this direction. I mean, when Georgia, for instance, got to New York, you know, she was only working on paper. She had painted before, but she felt comfortable with watercolors and, you know, pastels and charcoals and things like that. And basically, Siegel said, if you're going to be taken serious, you have to start painting in oil. And she really had to start working in the oil medium. And so he gave her that sort of guidance. And I think that if I had had a sharp dealer who would have helped her hone and focus, and also to have, you know, a curator's eye to edit things out, to, you know, let's not put this in, or let's say that for a different type of show. She did not have that going on. And so she was trying to exhibit it, and often she was exhibiting from a distance. Some of her shows in town, she was teaching in Alabama or, you know, wherever. And so someone was managing to get these works to, you know, these various venues for her. Yeah, but anyway, that's a long answer to your question. I'll stop there.
It's a good answer. Thank you. And I've had questions, I recall, from docents at the time when your exhibition was up and it was being reviewed, and they would ask me what they were supposed to say when they were asked about the relationship between Ida and Georgia. And I said that they can feel free to be honest, that that, you know, this did not bring out the best in Georgia, it seems, and certainly, you know, your account emphasizes that. We had a question from Dale Cronkright, a conservator at the museum, about what seems to have been Georgia's jealousy. Do you think that is indeed the right word to use to characterize that feeling?
I wouldn't use jealousy. I think Georgia was very territorial. I think she had worked many years very hard in difficult situations, going through difficult situations, almost deprivation, you know, living here and there, you know. While she liked Canyon, Texas, I think the school there was very unfulfilling for her, the situation, and she was feeling at lost ends. I mean, what's after this? another school and another school and another school. And you can see the frustration in her letters, her correspondence to, you know, Stieglitz. And so I think when it became a situation where she realized that her sisters were taking art very seriously, and also they were starting to exhibit where she did, I feel that she just felt that it was just too much. You know, she had particularly really encouraged Catherine's work. And then suddenly, here's Catherine doing some beautiful flowers. And Georgia, and they're huge, they're blown up flowers, you know, and so that was basically, she was doing Georgia's shtick, you know, and so that was really particularly bothersome for Georgia, and that's when she made her scathing demand to stop exhibiting, and I'm going to come tear your pictures up. And it's funny, once they finally made up years later, she sort of meekly, disingenuously, I think, asked Catherine, "Are you still painting?" I mean, after basically, when she wrote what she did to Catherine, you know, "I'm going to come tear your pictures to pieces," Catherine stopped painting. She just dropped it like a rock, and she never touched, you know, art again. You know, but Ida persisted. You know, she had every right to paint and to continue. She was not trying to replicate Georgia's subject matter or anything, or her style, but she felt she had the right to exhibit. But, you know, as I mentioned, Stieglitz eventually came around to working to trying to prevent her to use New York as a venue for her artwork.
When you were talking about this this project and how it came about, I think that this work that the curator can do, the sort of recovery of the reputation of an artist, is it's very interesting, and I've had this experience myself. And you used two words in that regard. You talked about sleuthing and the serendipity involved. For example, in discovering that someone had acquired this cache of Ida O'Keeffe material. And can you tell us a little bit more about that detective work?
Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, I actually started out going through Georgia's biographies to get any little snippet, any little clue that might place her somewhere at some time. And you know, she was teaching in such and such, and so I'd start looking. Or each piece of material I got, I just really combed through it to find any clue, and then I would follow that thread, which sometimes led to another thread. And again, getting hold of the records from Columbia and from Mount Sinai Hospital filled in a lot of gaps behind, but I also was able to get a hold of her records from Archives of American Art and another spot in New York, which had her application to the WPA application, which was being run at the time by Juliana Force, who was, you know, also at the Whitney Museum, but she was heading up the WPA for Manhattan. And so Ida would write in describing her project, and she writes in a letter, "I was at Chatham Hall 3 years." And that was the first, you know, mention I heard. She was actually there for 3, not just 2. And then seeing, you know, her application mentioning, you know, she was there as well. And then letters to, from that little, one of those, the twins out to their parents, in which one's, you know, said that, well, she says when she was here last year, da 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 da. And so I knew that she had been there, you know, previous years, and so she was there for 3 years. So little clues like that. But really, the lion's share, the mother lode, so to speak, was the gentleman calling from Nashville with his box. You know, it had artwork. It had some photographs by Stieglitz of her, and the one I think the one that was an exhibition was in that cache of works that he had, and also that scrapbook that you would have seen in the case in the exhibition, which basically she kept every brochure from every exhibition she participated in, all the critical remarks and newspaper clippings, everything was there. And so that's how I reconstructed the exhibition history for her. And then all these other things just came to the side. And I swear, I had no idea where she was the year of 37, 38. I had no idea. And out of the blue, you know, someone who had seen this article in the New York Times in 2014, this woman wrote to me And she said, in 1937-38, I was in London getting my master's, and my mother rented out my room to Ida O'Keeffe. This is what the address was. And then I looked at Ida's address on top of one of these letters, and that was the address. And so then I knew that Ida was in New York in 1937-38. She couldn't find a teaching job that year. Right. And so it was like these people came out of the woodwork to share what they knew about Ida O'Keeffe. It's like they had to get it off their chest, almost in a way, to make the effort to type an email or to pick up the phone, or write a snail mail letter. That was absolutely amazing to me, that these people really extended themselves in that way. And all of those little bits and pieces came together like a puzzle to create this pretty amazing picture, of, the works. So I can't say enough about. And another people I contacted, they had a cache of works that had been at an auction after Claudia O'Keeffe's death. This guy who got into her good graces and basically wheedled all of the property and everything, got it away from the family. He ended up selling all of Ida's stuff at an auction in LA about 8 months after Claudia's death. And these women had been at the auction and bought a bunch of stuff, and they contacted me. So it's just all of these weird sort of things, and that thing of crowdsourcing can really, bring things out of the woodwork. It was really fabulous, It made a very difficult job, a lot less so. Yeah. But this kind of sleuthing, it's very long term. It takes a long time. That's why I was always working on it in the background and having, my interns go contact this place and see what they've got, and on and on and on. It was pretty amazing.
Well, we're very grateful, I know, all of us, for that work and for your talk this evening. And I want to thank our members for joining us. And on behalf of the museum, thank you so much, Sue, once again, for being with us. And, and I see that there are some few questions popping up here. So if there are any last questions that I'm not able to ask you now, maybe we'll get those to you afterwards. Thank you again.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a delight, and I'm sorry about the end of the thing where it froze up on us. Okay.
No problem at all. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you. Good night, all.
Bye-bye.